So now we're going to cover the most important, well, one of the more important clauses in SQL. That is the where clause. Now the where clause enables us to search for records, an enormously powerful feature, as you can imagine. In the where clause applies a condition that we write, and the system will only return records that match that condition. Now you may have noticed if we come down here to the results pane and we use the scroll bar to go right down to the very bottom, that column at the far right there is actually not part of the data. It's just a sort of a row counter. It's a bit like the row numbers in Excel. And that, if we go right down the bottom, that can show us that we've got 19,972 rows being returned. That's quite a lot. Now let's say we don't want all the rows returned, we only want some of them returned, and we want the database to search for the rows that we want and return them. How can we do that? Well, I'm going to introduce another clause, and that's the where clause. The where clause, it's probably the most powerful clause in SQL, which allows us to search for the data we want. So I'm going to get stuck right into it. I'm going to start a new line after the from clause, and I'm going to type the following. Where, and I hit a tab key just to line up my text, where, let's say I'm interested in only those rows where the last name is Smith. I'm only interested in the Smiths. Only the people whose last name, where there's a Smith in this cell, that's the only ones I want. How do I type that? Well, I'm just going to type it and then we'll talk about it. Right, what have I just typed? Where last name, the column name, equals, and the value I'm interested in, Smith, surrounded by single quotes. So that is a condition. I'm just going to highlight that. That is a condition. That is a condition that a row must satisfy if it is to be returned in our query. So let's just run that. Now, and this is a bit of a trick. If I was to run that, notice how I've just highlighted a part of the query. That's the thing with Management Studio, is that you can highlight individual parts of something and execute them on their own. So if I highlight that little bit of text on its own, which is not a complete SQL statement, it's just a tiny part of it, and if I, with that bit of text selected, I hit execute, I'm going to get a big fat error message down the bottom here, because I'm telling it, hey, database, can you execute the command last name equals Smith? Well, that's not a command. That is a command. That's just one little part of it. So a little bit of a trap there. You can go and highlight bits of text for the purposes of cutting and pasting and what have you. But when you're running, don't have any text selected, otherwise you're going to end up with that problem. So I'll deselect that text. I've got no selected text, and now I will run my entire query. Okay, what has just happened? We have now got nothing but Smiths. Wonderful. And if we scroll down the very bottom, we've only got 103 rows. There are only 103 Smiths in our entire set. That's pretty cool. Now we can actually get even more elaborate with our where clauses, and we can specify more than one condition. I'm using that word again, condition. That thing about last name equals Smith, that is a condition. But we can have more than one condition. In fact, we can get quite elaborate with our wheres. But as an example of expanding on our where clause, let's say we're not only interested in the Smiths, but we're only interested in the Smiths that also have a first name of Denise. So they've got to be a Smith and they've got to be a Denise. How do we do that? Well, I'm just going to write the code and then we'll talk about it. So on my where clause line, I will add to it. And I'm helping using IntelliSense to help me out here. And first name equals Denise. So I'll execute that and then we'll talk about the results. And there we go. We've got two rows in that table that satisfy both conditions. Last name equals Smith and first name equals Denise. So we've passed two conditions to the query. One is last name has got to be Smith and first name has got to be Denise. Now, we've also combined those with the keyword and, because the system is effectively, it wants to know, it needs to know, well, hang on, you've given me two instructions, how do I combine them? Do they have to satisfy both conditions, only one? What is it? So they've got to satisfy both conditions. They've got to be a Smith and they've got to be a Denise, and we tell it using the keyword and. So again, we're seeing an example of how SQL is based on common ordinary language. We're telling it, give me everything where they're a Smith and they are a Denise. Now, let's just get rid of that second condition about Denise and put things back to where they are just the Smiths. Now, let's say we're not only interested in the Smiths, we're also interested in the Adamses as well. So we want the Smiths and the Adamses combined together. How do we do that? So we want to expand the condition. We're not interested in just the Smiths, we want to get some Adamses in there too. How do we do that? Well, this is how we code for that. So I'll just code it and then we'll talk about it. Right, what have I just done there? Where last name equals Smith or last name equals Adams. They can be a Smith or they can be an Adams. Let's run the query and see what happens. Well, that's exactly what's happened. We've got a whole bunch of Adamses in here, and if we scroll down about midway down, we can see the Smiths are down there as well. And if we scroll right down the bottom, we can see we've got 189 records, more records than the 103 we had earlier. So it's done exactly what we told it to do. Please give us everything where there's Smith or Adams. In other words, it's an or type situation. A record can satisfy either one of those two conditions. They can satisfy that one or they can satisfy that one. If they satisfy that or that, hey, you're in. We've sort of widened the net. Now, when you're discussing queries with people, with lay people, or you're in a meeting and you've got someone who's explaining to you the data that they want you to get, there can be a bit of is that what they are telling you or what you're describing in common language may not be 100% the way you code for it. So, for example, your boss may say to you, give me a list of the Smiths and the Adamses. The Smiths and the Adamses. So what he really means is he wants the Smiths or the Adamses. We want a record can be a Smith or an Adams. In other words, the net is wider, the condition is more relaxed, and you can have either or. So whereas in common language people may ask you for this and that, what they really mean is or. So you've got to sort of think in terms of database terms when you're interpreting people's requirements or explaining them to people. Now we can get even more elaborate with our conditions, and we can put as many conditions into the where clause as possible. So let's say we're not only interested in the Adamses and the Smiths, but the Abercrombies as well. So I can just whack another condition on here. So I'll just go or last name equals Abercrombie, and I will execute that. Hey presto, we've got another 2 rows being the Abercrombies. So they can be one of those, or one of those, or one of those, and they all get included. Great. Now I'm going to show you a bit of a potential pitfall here with SQL, and that's when you start mixing up your keywords in where clauses. So let's say out of all this bunch of people, the Smiths, the Adamses, and the Abercrombies, out of that bunch, we only want those whose first name is Eduardo. So that's going to narrow things down a fair bit, I think. There's not too many Eduardos out there. So let's just start a new line. And I will type in the keyword and. And let's see what happens. I'll execute that. Hang on, what's happened? That's not an Eduardo. That's not an Eduardo. She's definitely not an Eduardo. What's happened? Well, this is what happens when you start mixing your ands and ors. You get those really weird results. And I could explain to you that the way it works is that ands take precedence over the ors. And you know what, I could go on and demonstrate to you how how precedence works. It's a bit like, multiplication and arithmetic operators. The pluses and the minuses take precedence over multipliers, that sort of thing. It's a bit like that. Now, I could go on, but Basically, look, to be honest, it's so complicated. I'm not even going to bore you with this. Leave us say that it is a really bad idea to mix up ands and ors. So how do we fix this? Well, the way to do it is we've got to sort of partition off our ands and ors, sort of group them. And the way we do it is with brackets. It's much like brackets when you're doing mixing up arithmetical operators, your dividers and your multiplication and additions and things like that. So we're going to sort of partition them off, and the way we do it is with brackets. So what we really want is we want people to satisfy that joint condition of last names, and they also have to satisfy that as well. So we sort of group those conditions into one condition, if you like. So the way we do it is with a bracket. So I'll start at the beginning of the first condition we want to group, put an open curved bracket, and put a closed curved bracket. Let's see what happens now. Great, that's exactly what we want. We've got all the group that is a Smith or an Adams or an Abercrombie, all of them lumped in together, and then we apply that second and condition, and there we go. We've got a couple of Eduardos, and one's an Adams and one's a Smith, which makes sense. So that is a very big rule. That's a very big tip that I'm going to impart you with, and that is when you have a mixture of ands or ors, make sure you always partition off the ands and the ors with brackets so that everything makes sense. Now in our example, we used a series of ors to compare one field, last name, to 3 different values, and if it's an Abercrombie or an Adams or a Smith, it all gets returned. Well, there was actually a much simpler way to write that, and it's using another operator called in. Now I'm going to show you how to do it. I'm going to write it and then we'll discuss it. Okay, what's just happened? We've written where last name in and the 3 text values separated by commas in brackets. So it comes down to this keyword in, and the way it works is in supplies a literal list to compare to the column we want. So if last name is in the set of these values, it gets returned. So, and this list can be as long as you want. It can be 1, 2, 3, any one of a number of characters. And later on down the track, we'll probably do some more advanced queries where you can actually supply a set of values using a select command within those brackets, and the in will compare to those, and that's quite a powerful method in itself. Now I'm going to rejig the where clause here to select a specific record to demonstrate a particular problem when querying text strings. So here we go. Okay, what have we got here? We've got a gentleman here whose last name is O'Brien. That's O' Brian. Now, what would happen if we wanted to get a list of everybody who's got the last name O'Brien based on what we've learned so far? Let's see how we would do it. Well, we'll start typing. Open quote, O, quote, Brian, quote. What's just happened? We've got a whole bunch of errors. In fact, it's actually identifying an error right there by underlining it in red. Now, what's just happened? There's a quote there. Now, what have I been saying so far is when you're passing text parameters in a where clause, you delineate the text, that the value you're passing, by making the beginning and the end a single quote. But what if the value itself contains a quote? This confuses SQL because it doesn't know where the value is supposed to end and it's supposed to begin if what is delineating the beginning and end is actually stuck in there in the value, as you can see. So how do we handle something like that? We delineate it by simply putting 2 quotes. So when you've got 2 quotes, the actual technical name for that is an escape character. It's sort of a secret way of saying, hey, SQL, when I say 2 quotes, I really mean 1. So let's see how that happens. And hey presto, we've got an O'Brien returned, no problem. And we'll come to those later in the course. You can have more than one condition within a where clause, and those conditions can be combined with an and or an or keyword. If you've got many conditions and you've got a mixture of ands or ors in your where clause, you have to partition those ands or ors with rounded brackets. We also learned that in addition to the comparison operators and or, there is also in, a very powerful command where you can pass a set of values of variable length, variable numbers of values in that set. And lastly, we learned that if the value we're seeking actually has a single quote in it, we pass that in by quote quote.